I figured this would be a good time to talk about my methodology whenever I'm doing character profiles or sci-fi pulsi or reactionary reviews, or if I'm talking about lore, that kind of thing. Because frequently what happens is I'll get comments underneath it, this isn't the case, you're misrepresenting this, you got this wrong, etc. And in a lot of cases, I do get things wrong because a lot of things, there's a lot of lore, and sometimes the lore contradicts the other lore. And I know it doesn't always look like it, but I do normally do pre reading and do research before these videos. But in a lot of cases, it's also, I guess you could say, deliberate. Whether it's me deliberately ignoring parts of the source material, me inserting kind of my own ideas there, my own interpretation, etc. So let's just take a step back. So there's a concept in kind of postmodern literature called the death of the author, which is the idea that authors don't have any particular insight into their own works. That is, my interpretation of a work is as valid as the author's interpretation of the work. And that's kind of where you get a lot of relativism and postmodern film criticism and that sort of thing. And obviously, that's a very extreme position. The idea that you can't look at where the author comes from at all, what their life experience is, and what kind of motivated it. At the same time, though, I think it's a mistake to interpret things 100% as the author says that they did it. Because in a lot of cases, when you're writing something, you might not remember the source. You might be channeling some themes that you consciously, especially afterwards, you might have changed your opinion about something or changed your mind ideologically or personally, or you've had a different relationship, and you look back on something you wrote, and either consciously or subconsciously you retroactively change the meaning of that in order to be more in line with what you do at present. And I'm sure I do that whenever I'm telling stories about what I used to think in the past. You try to frame it both to yourself and to other people more in line with what you're thinking today. Or you might just be ashamed of it, a point you're trying to make. Or once again, your conscious understanding of something might be different than your subconscious understanding of something. So my point is, I think you kind of have to take a middle ground on this sort of thing. You can't slavishly say absolutely everything. Also, authors often will lie, or they'll try to troll you, or they'll try to misdirect. Like George R. R. Martin is very famous for this, for just throwing stuff out there that doesn't necessarily turn out to be true as a way to kind of subvert expectations and that sort of thing. So, like, if George R. R. Martin says something before a book to try to, like, get people thinking the wrong thing, but then in the book, it's clearly not the case, which one are you supposed to go with? Are you supposed to go with the case where he was trolling because he explicitly said that, or are you supposed to go with the actual book and what it says there? My point being, these things aren't 100% straightforward. I think you also have to look at the cultural context, because we do absorb things from around us. We absorb things, like you might have seen a TV show sometime, you might have a quote in your mind, and you don't necessarily know where it came from, but it can worm its way very deep inside of your mind. Also, there are just certain universal themes like the hero's journey, things like Jungian archetypes, all that sort of thing that just comes from being human. And they're things that appear in almost every human culture. And even if you're not consciously channeling them, or you're consciously trying to make them as a universal signal, someone from another culture would probably be fairly easily able to see that sort of thing. And their interpretation of it might be correct. I mean, let's look at most religions, for instance, believe that they're the only religion that's true, or they're the religion that's the most true, is probably a better way to put it. So Christians, for instance, believe that Christ died for everybody on earth, regardless of whether they're Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, whatever. Christ died for them, and that the Christian metaphysical worldview is the correct one. So therefore, all these other people live within the Christian metaphysical worldview, or within the Christian world. So they might be channeling kind of some of these themes. They might be kind of having contact with Christ but they don't necessarily know it because that's the underlying reality. And Muslims are also like that because they refer to people who convert to Islam as reverts because they believe everyone is naturally born a Muslim. Buddhists and Hindus also have a similar universalist idea, so they'll often adopt like Jesus or Santa Claus or something as being a god in their pantheon. Or some will try to syncretize it and say Jesus is an avatar of Vishnu or something like that. So you can see there is a lot of cross cultural stuff there. So if you're reading into somebody else's culture, something from yours, it's not necessarily not the case. So I think that's kind of the first thing is you kind of have to take a middle path on this time. There's also just the issue of whether or not you're learning something. And sometimes I guess you have to subordinate, is this kind of a useful criticism? Is this a useful interpretation versus what they're actually saying? So that's kind of a bit of how I go into it. And that's just kind of a bit, I guess, my theoretical background. Now, what is the methodology I use when I'm writing like points for this, or I'm coming up with what I'm going to say? Is I will do research into the material. Generally speaking, I don't read other people's interpretations just because I'd rather come to my own. So I'll go on the Wikipedia or I'll go and find like some just raw information, like some dates, numbers, descriptions, episode summaries, that kind of thing. So I'll read all of that. And then what I find with just about any type of fiction, even like giant sprawling universes, is there's a lot of holes. A lot of the time, the guts are just something that's not really explained. Like the electoral system or the tax system or the political parties and what they stand for, or like what the social programs are, how the military is structured, or the relations of the country in question to the rest of the world. Those things are just not addressed. And that's not a fault or a failing with it. They just might not be that important for the story they're trying to tell. Like just off the top of my head, in Animorphs, they don't talk a lot about the Yeerks' campaigns against other people because that's not really important to the story they're trying to tell about the kids taking on the Yeerk Empire on Earth. And you'll often have these, they'll refer to something big going on in the background, but it's not really a focus, even though it is probably important in a geopolitical sense, but it's not relevant to the story that's trying to be told. And you also will see this in like the original Star Wars films. There's all these things going on in the background. Like there's the Galactic Civil War raging, but we don't really see much of it because it's not important. And it is, that stuff is missing, but it's not a fault of George Lucas and it's not a fault of the film series. So when I'm reviewing something, I try to fill that in. And I try to fill that in by looking at similar fictional things and more generally real world equivalents. Like I'll try to say like the Brotherhood of Darkness is a bit like the I forget how you pronounce it. The Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, where all the nobles were technically equal and they all had veto power. So it's kind of similar to that. The New Order in Star Wars is very much like fascism, and it's based on fascism, but you could go a bit deeper than that, and you can kind of extrapolate that. To a certain extent, it's not even extrapolation, because the New Order has things like the Coalition for Progress and minimalism and like grandiosity or the official art movement or that kind of thing. So anywhere where you're kind of lacking stuff, I think it's fair to go to like fascist Italy or National Socialist Germany and just kind of fill in the blanks and go, okay, this is obviously the closest thing in real life, and let's fill it in. Or like, for example, with the Zybok Empire in Escaflowne, I don't think explicitly they say the Zybok Empire is a technocracy/magocracy where it's run by engineers and mages and its rank is based on technical skill. I don't think they explicitly state that, but it's very clear that that's how their society is structured. And it's most similar to, I guess, kind of the real world ideology or the real world structure, which would be technocracy. So that's kind of, I guess, kind of part two. So part three is there's a term called parsimony, which is makes sense or feels right. That is, the various parts kind of just make sense together. And that is always my goal over strict canonicity. That is, does what they're saying make sense? Is it consistent with other stuff within the universe? Is it logical? Does it follow a natural plot progression? If you add just a little bit of realism, does any of this functionally work? And it doesn't matter if it's like fantasy or science fiction or something. People are kind of people, and if just completely like random character changes happen that don't make any sense and are very clearly in there to just assassinate a particular character, like Stan is burning his daughter, then I think you can question that, and you can just kind of dismiss it and kind of say, no, that's not canon or whatever. Because like, people screw up. People can suck at writing their own characters. And obviously, I think the best example of all of this is the Game of Thrones TV show. My issue with it wasn't necessarily that it didn't follow the books, because there was a lot of bad stuff in the books that happened. My issue with it was it didn't follow its own internal logic. And as time went on and you saw like the actors interviews, they'd be like, Steve Delane would go, I don't know why my character did any of this. The way Sansa went didn't really make any sense whatsoever compared to her like earlier personality. Daenerys going crazy, I don't think was really hinted at like at all. And it was just completely sudden. So it's like, just because they're D&D or the creators, do we have to accept all this nonsense? Do we have to say, okay, well, the creators said it, it's not internally consistent, it's not thematically consistent, but they're the author. They're the creators, so their word goes, and I just don't think that's the case. And I think people can be out of canon within their own universe, and they can write fan fiction with their own characters. And that's kind of my perspective. So if I sometimes will just change details or do motivations or rewrite history, it's in the pursuit of me trying to come up with a logical progression. It's me trying to come up with something that internally, thematically, and realistically makes sense. And that is kind of more important than anything particular the author said. So there's that. So I admit I will change details from time to time. I will make things up. I will just kind of screw around a bit with canon. And that's not always me just being unaware. Like, sometimes it is a mistake, but if you read any review of anything or watch any lore video, they're going to make a lot of mistakes. That's just kind of the nature of content creation. That's the nature of having a lot of these things where things within it contradict other things within it, and they can't both be true. And people kind of pick and choose which one they want, and there's nothing wrong with that. To me, the focus is it internally like consistent with the characters, with the themes, and with the way in which the universe operates, is kind of what I go for. And I guess secondarily, how does it relate to a similar situation in real life? Because it should play out at least somewhat similarly. Like, just because they have spaceships and they have like dragons or whatever, like I said, people are still people, politics are still politics, power dynamics are still power dynamics. In real life, you can have countries with nuclear weapons dealing with countries that don't have nuclear weapons, or countries with air forces dealing with ones who don't. And the power dynamic is there, and it's similar to one side having dragons or whatever. So that is kind of my methodology. I hope that clears things up. I hope people enjoyed that and they kind of got something out of it.